Okay, so now hopefully you've got the hang of that. We can move on to adding more objects into the scene. So we'll come out of edit mode at the top there, press tab, and we'll choose object mode. This is where we can add more objects. We'll delete this cube by pressing X on the keyboard, and then confirming by clicking on delete. That will delete the selected object. And now we can start adding more objects. So we've got the menu items at the top here, where we can choose to add objects, or we can press Shift A, and we've got that pop-up menu which gives us the same things we've got in here, just without having to mess about going all the way up there. So Shift A, wherever your mouse is, you'll get the menu pop up. And you've got various options of what you'd like to add. So you can add a mesh. These are sort of objects with geometry, like a cube, or Shift A, and we'll add a torus, or we can even add Shift A, mesh, and then a monkey. So we've got lots of different things we can add, and these are sort of starting objects that we can then modify the geometry of. I'm going to change this back now to global for the transform orientation. Once we've got multiple objects in the scene, we can then edit them by going into edit mode, and we've got access to the geometry, and we can do things like duplicate them. So if I choose this monkey, I press Shift D, and then I move it. And we've got two monkeys, but they're both unique objects. They've both got unique geometry. So if I come into the data panel down here, the object, the selected object, it will show us the geometry here. So this one's using a geometry called Suzanne. If I click on this one, it's using a geometry called Suzanne.001. So if I modify this one by going into edit mode, select a vertex, move it around, it's not going to affect this one. So what I can do is I can grab this monkey here, and I'll press Alt D this time instead of Shift D. I can move that around. And now we've got two monkeys, but if we look in the data panel here, you can see we've got this number 2, which indicates how many objects in the scene are using this geometry. So this one and this one, they're still both unique objects, so that we can add different modifiers to each without affecting the other, but they both use the same geometry. That means if I modify one of these, it's going to modify the other one as well. And that's useful, for example, if you've got multiple objects that are identical, it's always better to use an instance, so an object that's using the same geometry, so that you use less RAM. The less RAM, the better. You get better performance in the viewport, and you'll get faster rendering as well. Right, so let's have a look at some of the other objects we can add. So let's come back out of edit mode, so tab, back into object mode, and we'll do Shift A. We've also got curves. So a curve is just a line in 3D space, which if we go into edit mode, we can move the individual points around in order to create a different sort of shaped line. And that line can be used either for modeling purposes, or we can use it to make objects follow along, sort of a path for the objects to follow along. And we'll look at that later. Back into object mode, Shift A. We've got surfaces. So these are sort of mathematical surfaces, similar to what you'd get in a CAD program. But in Blender, they're not really much use, to be honest with you. So not many people will use those. Metaballs, these are sort of shapes that will, if you create one of those and then duplicate, Shift D, then morph together to create a custom object. Again, I don't think these get used very much, but once you've done that, you can then right click to get the context menu. So this is a menu that will bring up the options relevant to whatever you've got selected, and you can convert it maybe to a mesh, and then you've now got an actual geometry that you can then go into edit mode and start moving these vertices around if you want to. So back into object mode, Shift A, we've got text. So if I move that across, go into edit mode, we can start typing as so. And if I want to, I can then go back into object mode, right click, convert that to a mesh, and then we can go into edit mode, and we can start grabbing all of these things. So if I go into face mode, I can then carry out one of the edit mode operations, which is just basically a function that does something to your selected geometry. So if I press E, this is the extrude operator. I can then extrude those up, and now we've got a 3D text. So back into object mode. Next thing, Shift A, we've got volumes. This is if you're going to be adding clouds or anything that's got a volumetric sort of a feel to it, clouds, mist, steam, smoke, etc. Grease pencil. This is if you're doing 2D artwork in Blender. We've got armatures that we looked at earlier. This is an object specifically for bones, which we can then use to control geometry, which is parent to it, as we saw in the previous example. Lattice or lattice is just something that bends geometry. We won't be using that. Empties, these are very useful. These are things that don't render, but you can use them as helpers in your scene. For example, if you were to make your objects children of one of these empties, you can then control the empty and the children will follow along. So if you move an empty or rotate an empty, the children will rotate around it or move with it. Images, this is if you've got reference images you want to model to. You've got your lights, obviously, if you want to add light into your render. And you've got light probes, these are for Eevee, so the Eevee render engine, which we won't be using, but this is just to make your Eevee renders look more realistic using sort of a less intensive way of calculating reflections and indirect lighting. Cameras we'll be using, obviously. Speakers, this is just to play sound in your scene, so that as the camera moves past it, you'll get sound in a particular location. We won't be using those. Force fields, we saw earlier, these are to have an influence on objects in the scene that have got physical properties. And then we've got collection instances, which basically, a collection is just one of these folders in the outliner so that you can organize objects into different sections. So let's say I've got the cube, this monkey, and this torus. What I can do is put those into a new collection by pressing M for the shortcut on the keyboard. New collection, I call it test. Press OK. We've now got this test collection. And if I want to, I can now instance this entire collection by pressing Shift A, collection instance, and then choose test. And now I've got a duplicate there, but this doesn't actually use any memory, any new memory, because it's a complete instance. It doesn't use any geometry at all. These are just one instance, which is represented in the outliner by this little box we've got here, which indicates it's a collection instance. And in actuality, it's just an empty that tells Blender whereabouts to draw those objects. So what I'd like to do now is pause the video and have a play around with adding all the different types of objects. Try the two methods I showed you of duplicating objects, one that uses the same geometry and one that uses a new geometry, an identical geometry. Try each of the object's edit modes. So for example, you saw that the text has got a different way of editing than, for example, the curves or the geometry. Use the context menu to convert the text into a geometry and then use the extrude operator in edit mode on a selection of faces of the text to make it into a 3D text object. And then organize a few of the objects into a new collection in the outliner and then add a collection instance and move it around a bit. Alright, so best of luck and I'll see you shortly.